Imagine being Prime Minister, publicly celebrating a return to Britain of someone you describe as a priority for your government, saying you are delighted he has been reunited with his loved ones and paying tribute to everyone who campaigned for his release, only to have Piers absolutely eviscerate you on social media by pointing out that all you had to do was check the guy's social media history to discover he branded Brits dogs and monkeys, called for Zionists to be killed, and boasted of his hatred for white people. That is exactly what has just happened to Keir Starmer after he welcomed Egyptian dissident El-Fattah back to the UK on Boxing Day without apparently doing even the most basic due diligence on his historic social media posts. Morgan, never one to miss an opportunity to land a devastating blow, reshared Starmer's celebratory post with a scathing response saying nothing symbolizes our government incompetence more than the Prime Minister celebrating a vile, racist, anti-Semite who wanted to kill Jews, police, and white people. El-Fattah has now issued an apology for his shocking and hurtful posts, claiming they were twisted out of their meaning and were expressions of a young man's anger written during regional crises. But the damage to Starmer's reputation is done, and calls are growing for El-Fattah to have his British citizenship revoked, which would be the ultimate humiliation for a Prime Minister who made this case a top priority. Quick favor. If you are absolutely stunned by this spectacular own goal where Starmer celebrates someone's return to Britain without checking their social media history first and gets destroyed by Piers Morgan, hit that subscribe button right now. Over 94% of you watching have not subscribed yet. It is completely free, takes literally 2 seconds, and helps us keep bringing you these moments where political leaders make catastrophic errors and get publicly humiliated. Cheers if you did. Now back to this absolutely brutal takedown. Let us start with what El-Fattah actually wrote on social media, because understanding the specific post is crucial to grasping why this is such a political disaster for Starmer. El-Fattah branded Brits dogs and monkeys, which is not political criticism or robust debate, but straightforward dehumanizing racist language. Calling an entire nation dogs and monkeys is a kind of rhetoric that has historically preceded and accompanied genocide and mass violence. It strips people of their humanity and makes it easier to justify violence against them. The fact that someone who wrote those words about British people has been welcomed back to Britain by the British Prime Minister is genuinely shocking. El-Fattah also called for Zionists to be killed, which is not criticism of Israeli government policy but explicit advocacy for murder based on political or religious identity. You can criticize Zionism as political ideology, you can oppose Israeli government actions in Palestine, you can support Palestinian rights, all without calling for people to be killed. The moment you cross that line into advocating murder, you have moved from legitimate political discourse into incitement to violence. The fact that he is now in Britain, protected by British citizenship and British laws, having advocated for killing people based on their identity, is deeply troubling. He also boasted of his hatred for white people, which again is not political analysis or cultural criticism, but racial hatred pure and simple. Replace white people with any other racial group and imagine the response. If someone wrote that they hated black people or Asian people or Jewish people, they would rightly be condemned as a racist and potentially prosecuted for hate speech. But apparently hatred directed at white people is somehow less serious or more understandable, at least according to those who are defending El-Fattah or downplaying the significance of his posts. These comments emerged following his return to the UK on Boxing Day after spending several years in prison in Egypt. El-Fattah was imprisoned by Egyptian authorities on charges related to political activism, and human rights organizations had campaigned for his release on the grounds that he was a political prisoner being held in harsh conditions. From a pure human rights perspective, you can understand why people would want someone released from an authoritarian prison system. But human rights are not absolute, and they do not require Britain to welcome back people who have expressed hatred for British people and call for violence against others. Ahead of these abhorrent tweets resurfacing, Prime Minister Keir Starmer celebrated El-Fattah's return in a social media post saying he was delighted El-Fattah is back on British soil and has been reunited with his loved ones who may be feeling profound relief. That language, delighted and profound relief, suggests genuine happiness and celebration rather than grudging acceptance of a legal obligation. Starmer was not saying we have fulfilled our human rights obligations. He was saying I am delighted this person is back. That is a significant difference because it reveals Starmer's personal judgment about El-Fattah rather than just his government's legal position. Starmer also wrote on Boxing Day that El-Fattah's case has been a top priority for my government since we came to office. A top priority. Not one of many cases we are working on, not an issue we take seriously, but a top priority. When you make something a top priority, you are saying it is among the most important things your government is working on. For Starmer to describe securing El-Fattah return as a top priority, and then have these social media posts emerge suggesting El-Fattah is a racist who has called for violence is catastrophically bad political judgment. It raises obvious questions about what exactly Starmer's priorities are, and whether he understands the concerns of ordinary British people. Starmer also paid tribute to Allah's family and to all those who worked and campaigned for this moment. That gratitude and recognition of campaigners is appropriate in many circumstances, but when the person being welcomed back turns out to have a history of racist statements and calls for violence, it makes you look like you were captured by activist pressure rather than making sound judgments based on national interest. Campaigners are often motivated by genuine human rights concerns, but they can also have blind spots of priorities that do not align with broader public sentiment. A prime minister needs to balance human rights obligations with security concerns and public confidence, and Starmer clearly failed to do that here. Taking to X with his millions of followers, Piers Morgan reshared Starmer's post about El-Fattah being back in the UK accompanied by what can only be described as an absolutely scathing response. Nothing symbolizes our government's incompetence more than this post by the Prime Minister 2 days ago about a vile, racist, anti-Semite who wanted to kill Jews, police, and white people and called the British dogs and monkeys. All he had to do was check El-Fattah's social media history. That final line is a killer blow because it highlights just how avoidable this disaster was. Starmer did not need sophisticated intelligence analysis or complex legal advice to discover El-Fattah's problematic posts. He just needed to check the guy's social media, which literally anyone with an internet connection can do in about 5 minutes. Morgan's description of El-Fattah as vile, racist, and anti-Semite is strong language but arguably justified given the content of posts. Calling for Jews to be killed is definitionally anti-Semitic. Expressing hatred for white people is definitionally racist. Using dehumanizing language about British people is vile. These are not partisan characterizations. They're accurate descriptions of what El-Fattah wrote. The fact that Morgan can accurately describe him this way using El-Fattah's own words makes Starmer's decision to celebrate his return look even worse. The accusation of this symbolizes government incompetence is particularly damaging because it goes beyond this specific case to suggest a pattern of poor judgment and inadequate preparation. If the government cannot be bothered to check someone's social media history before the Prime Minister publicly celebrates their return, what other corners are they cutting? What other obviously available information are they ignoring? Competence is one of the basic requirements voters expect from government, and this incident suggests alarming levels of incompetence at the highest levels. El-Fattah has now issued an apology for his shocking and hurtful social media posts, which he wrote more than a decade ago. The apology came this morning, 3 days after his return and after the post had been widely shared and condemned. The timing is significant because it suggests the apology is reactive damage control rather than proactive acknowledgement of wrongdoing. If El-Fattah genuinely regretted these posts and understood how harmful they were, he could have addressed them years ago rather than waiting until they became a political scandal. El-Fattah wrote that looking at the tweets now, the ones that were not completely twisted out of their meaning, he understands how shocking and hurtful they are, and for that he unequivocally apologizes. That qualifier, the ones that were not completely twisted out of their meaning, is interesting because it suggests some of his posts are being misinterpreted while implicitly acknowledging that others are not. But which ones exactly were twisted? Calling British people dogs and monkeys seems pretty unambiguous. Calling for Zionists to be killed is clear. Expressing hatred for white people does not require much interpretation. The attempt to suggest some posts were twisted feels like trying to minimize the extent of the problem rather than fully owning responsibility. El-Fattah explained that the posts were mostly expressions of a young man's anger and frustrations in a time of regional crises including the wars in Iraq, Lebanon, and Gaza, and the rise of police brutality against Egyptian youth. This context is meant to make the post more understandable, but does it actually excuse them? Plenty of people were angry about wars in Iraq, Lebanon, and Gaza without calling for people to be killed or expressing racial hatred. Anger at injustice is legitimate. Turning that anger into racist abuse and calls for violence is not. The context explains why he might have been angry, but does not justify what he chose to do with that anger. El-Fattah particularly regrets posts that were written as part of online insult battles with total disregard for how they read to other people. He should have known better. This framing treats the posts as unfortunate casualties of heated online arguments rather than expressions of genuinely held beliefs. But even if we accept that some posts were written in the heat of online combat, that does not change what they said or how they impact people who read them. Saying you hated white people or that British people are dogs and monkeys is not meaningfully different whether you wrote it because you genuinely believe it or because you were angry during an online argument. The broader question this incident raises is about the government's vetting processes and political judgment. How did El-Fattah's case become a top priority without anyone apparently checking his public social media history? These posts were not hidden in private messages or discovered through intelligence intercepts. They were publicly available on social media platforms that anyone can access.